Hello everyone and welcome to EIA's HGL-by-rail webinar. My name is Arup Malik. I'm an economist here at EIA in the Biofuels and Emerging Technologies group. Start off with a few introductions. In the room with me we have my co-presenter Warren Wilczewski, Mindy Farber-Deanda, the team lead for Biofuels and Emerging Technologies, Jonathan Kogan from our Office of Communications, Julie Harris from the Office of Energy Statistics, and Jim O'Sullivan, who's also on the Biofuels and Emerging Technologies team. I'm going to start with a brief overview of the HGL-by-rail data that was released at the end of January. This is the last rail data series that we'll be producing from third-party rail data. It includes 4 products: propane, propylene, normal butane, and isobutane. And as I talk to you all, I'll go through the data on the website. In 2015, in March of 2015, we released the crude by rail data. Last year, we released the ethanol data, which I'll click to here quickly. And as I said, we just released the last 4 products: propane, propylene, normal butane, and isobutane. For those of you that don't know, all of EIA's petroleum data is published on a Petroleum Administration for Defense District, or PAD basis. So I'll put up a PAD map so you can see what I'm talking about. So PAD 5 is the West Coast, PAD 4 is the Rocky Mountain region, PAD 3 the Gulf Coast, PAD 2 the Midwest, and PAD 1 the East Coast. All of our rail data is produced on a monthly basis and published with the Petroleum Supply Monthly. The rail data go back to 2010 and include interpad, intrapad, and movements between the U.S. and Canada. So this is the web page that hosts all of our rail data. From the EIA homepage, if you go to Sources and Uses, Petroleum and Other Liquids, click on Data, then Imports, Exports, and Movements, and scroll down a bit. You can see this link here that says Movements of Crude Oil and Select Products by Rail, and that'll bring you to the page that I had up previously. On this page, you will find all the intrapad movements of rail, and it's the only place where you can find the intrapad. So just as an example, for PAD 1-to-1 propane, you'll see I went to the top here and I picked propane as the product. You can see the movements within PAD 1 of propane. If you click this link on the right-hand side, it'll bring you to a graph of the entire data history for that movement. One important thing to note about this HGL-by-rail data is it has improved EIA's product supplied for these 4 products. So product supplied is our proxy for demand, and if we go to the product supplied page, you can see what the product supplied is for propane and propylene is after the rail data. I took a screenshot of what product supplied was before we introduced the rail data, which I'll put up on the screen now. And hopefully it's easy to see that it's not exactly aligned because now we have the extra month of data, so I'll try and align it here for you guys on the fly. But you can see that on a regional basis, product supplied for propane and propylene has changed due to the introduction of the rail data. It's important to note here that product supplied for the U.S. as a whole has not changed, and that the rail data has these 4 products by themselves, but for products supplied, we do combine propane, propylene, normal butane, butylene, and isobutane with isobutylene. An additional change is in the Petroleum Supply Monthly, Table 60, now includes the interpad movements, only the interpad movements for all 7 products for which we have rail data. This morning, we released a Today in Energy article, which you can get to from our homepage. And next week, we plan on publishing a This Week in Petroleum, a natural gas weekly update in the news article, and additional twips and ties in the coming months. I'll now pass it to my colleague Warren, who will go over some of the methodology and some analysis of this data.
Thank you, Arup, and thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar. So if we go through our data and just look at, first of all, where it's coming from. And what you'll find is that just like with crude oil or with ethanol and biodiesel, we went to the same source, the Surface Transportation Board, who has a data sharing agreement with us to provide us with movements or a sample of movements that represent the totality of shipments on rail in the United States. Now, the sample file that we receive, of course, is not like a survey that EIA would design, and as a result, we do have to tailor the data we receive from the Surface Transportation, the STB, to work within the parameters that we have for our own data reporting. For those of you who have seen the crude by rail or the ethanol by rail slides in the past and who are perhaps familiar with the way that we have processed that data, you will find that the flowchart that I have presented is very similar to what we did for crude and for ethanol. And in fact, the major difference is in number 3, where what we have really done is taken data that comes from the Surface Transportation Board, which comes on a variety of product codes that don't line up with EIA product codes. And what we needed to do was apportion those products to their proper categories so that we can present them the way that you are familiar with, which is it's propane, it's propylene, it's normal butane, it's isobutane, rather than presenting to you various categories of mixed product that really don't reveal anything about the market that's of use to our data consumers. So the way that we have done a lot of this is what you see in front of you is a map of the stations that we have identified as handling hydrocarbon gas liquids. So we're calling this HGL because we're talking about refinery and gas plant production of both alkanes and olefins. So we're talking propane and propylene. We're talking about normal butane, isobutane. We're not addressing in our rail data ethane, ethylene, or natural gasoline because we found that the quality of the data is not sufficient enough to actually warrant the effort and the presentation of this data in our tables. So what you see here are over 1,000 unique stations or origin or destination points for HGL by rail. And for each one of those points, we have assigned a category from the right-hand side. So one of these asset classes applies to each one of those products for both an origin and a destination, allowing us to determine with a high degree of certainty what kind of product is in fact being moved from that station or to that station. Why is that important? It's important because as you see on the left-hand side, the chart is showing what kind of data we actually see in this data set that's released from the Surface Transportation Boards to us. And across the years, between 2010 and 2016, anywhere between 75 and 60% of all volumes moved by rail come under some kind of a mixed product code, right? So it can be LPG gas, which is the majority of all movements. It can also be this petroleum byproducts, which is some kind of a mix of butane, butylene, isobutane. So we needed a method to refine this mix into the categories that you see on the right. And what you see is a representative split of the propylene, the propane, normal butane, isobutane, and the butylenes and natural gasoline, which we will not report, primarily because, as I had mentioned before, the data is simply of insufficient quality for us to feel confident in the data that in the numbers we're reporting. So in addition to the fact that we have excluded natural gasoline and butylenes from the sample, we have also focused on some pad pairings, but not all. And in general, the rule that we have established is that if the movements do not pass the 6,000 barrel per day threshold on a regular basis, we will not report those movements. However, what we have determined is that in some cases the quality of the data is in fact sufficient enough to report smaller movements, and not only that, but in some cases these movements make a significant difference for analytical purposes. And just to give you an example of one of those reasons, for pad 5, if we had excluded movements into pad 5 that don't pass the 6,000 barrel per day threshold, EIA would continue to report almost no movements into pad 5 of hydrocarbon gas liquids, because right now there are no pipelines that deliver this product, and there are also no waterways that allow marine transport from other pads into pad 5, into the West Coast. So looking at the data holistically, where are we relative to crude oil or to ethanol and biodiesel, which we have already reported? This is 2010 to 2016 through November. This is the data that we're presenting and the data that we have worked on. And this is the same time period that applies to the other products. So what you will see is that, crude oil in 2010, of course, came from very minor quantities, peaked in 2014 at over 1 million barrels a day. And in 2016 through November, we are now looking at about 480, I believe, 1,000 barrels on average over the course of the year, through November, of course. What you'll see in ethanol is that the volumes of ethanol and biodiesel are fairly constant across that period, whereas quantities of HGL, and here we're adding up all 4 of the products we've released the data for, are now surpassing 400,000 barrels a day. And in fact, now that crude oil has come down, they are coming fairly close to crude oil by rail data numbers. Of course, propane leads, and this shouldn't be too much of a surprise to many of our listeners. Propane serves a variety of markets. Many of them are scattered throughout the country in remote areas where pipelines don't reach. Propane is also, of course, produced in many areas, and it's the largest product if you're looking at gas plant liquids. So it leads the volumes for hydrocarbon gas liquids by rail. This is a similar chart, only focusing now on hydrocarbon gas liquids by rail. And what you see is, of course, that a lot of this uptick, especially since 2012, coincides fairly well with what you know about production, which has also taken off during that period of time, especially from gas plants, and especially in regions like Appalachia or like the Bakken, where rail really is perhaps the only or a major option for people to move those products out. So just drilling down on the impact of rail and how these numbers stack up, what you'll see is in 2010 on the left-hand side chart, you see, for example, pad 1 as being primarily a recipient of, and this is propane only now. So this wouldn't be too much of a surprise to those of you who use propane for heating or who work in the propane industry. Not too much pipeline capacity, especially into places like New England or the Florida Panhandle, and rail serves a good purpose for moving product there. However, if you compare 2010 to 2016, not only is pad 1 impacted in that now it's also a net shipper, but what you also see is that there is a major movement of product, especially from pad 2 to pad 3. Right? You have pad 2 now being a significant shipper, over almost 60,000 barrels a day of railed propane coming out of pad 2, and simultaneously growth of receipts in pad 3 has also come up to almost 60,000 barrels a day. So there's a lot of movement, and a lot of that, if you look at our tables, which Arup had shown previously, you will see that a lot of the movement is indeed pad 2 to pad 3. So how does that stack up against other modes of transport? Well, pipelines remain the primary mode of transport for propane in the United States. But what you can see is, for example, again, looking at pad 1, pipelines have reduced their deliveries into pad 1. A lot of that has to do with the fact that now rail is moving product within pad 1 from producing areas to consuming areas. But again, pad 2 and pad 3 are what really stands out. Right? You have a fairly balanced market, if you include rail now, in pad 2, with pipeline takeaway and with pipeline delivered and rail shipped propane more or less balancing itself out. Moving to 2016, suddenly both pipelines and rail are shipping product out, and pad 3 has become a significant recipient of propane from essentially throughout the country, by both rail and pipe. So rail here really serves to enhance the quality of the data and really shows the difference between 2010 and 2016 on a net basis that we have not been able to show before. And of course, because our product supply tables, as Arup has mentioned before, serve for many of our data customers as a proxy for consumption of product. Now, currently our product supply tables are for propane and propylene combined. So this data is also for propane and propylene combined. What you can see is the impact of rail, and here again, PAD 2 and PAD 3 definitely stand out. So if you look at both 2010 and 2016, let's take PAD 2 for example. If you look at the blue line, which is without rail, what you see is that in some ways, doesn't seem like there's much of a difference in terms of product delivered into PAD 2, right, or product consumed if you take our product supplied as meaning consumption in PAD 2. You add in rail, however, and suddenly the product supplied now with rail drops in PAD 2. If you look at PAD 3, it significantly increases. And a lot of that has to do with the way that our product supply tables are created, which is we take interpad movements, which until the 31st of January, until 2 days ago, was just pipeline and barge, or tanker and barge. Now we put in rail, and when you have these product supply tables, you're factoring in imports and exports. And PAD 3, of course, has been a major source of U.S. exports of propane. And now, with rail, you can see that even though these rails have been taking the product supply down, with rail, product supply comes back up again. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that PAD 3 really hasn't seen all that much decline in terms of consumption or in terms of petrochemical throughput in the industry. So PAD 3, that number certainly looks more viable when you consider that with rail than without. So, and now just taking a dive into PAD 1 again, just for those of you who are trying to kind of square where rail is relative to our other data, so here PAD 1 actually serves as an excellent example of what has been happening in the market, right? So the Appalachian region, right? So we're talking, because it's PAD 1, so we're talking about the western counties in Pennsylvania and with West Virginia. Production of hydrocarbon gas liquids, and especially natural gas plant liquids, so propane, normal butane, and isobutane, has really taken off in PAD 1. And if you were looking at just interpad transfers and looking at the pipeline and marine shipments, you would assume, and safely so, that a lot of that production is remaining in PAD 1. However, now with rail data, what you can see is that more than half of all production in PAD 1 moves by rail. Now this is within and outside PAD 1, but what it really serves to do for those who are looking at our data and trying to divine something out of the data, what you can see is that rail has really stepped up and allowed for that production to grow and allowed for that production to reach its markets, whether it's storage for winter use in the summer or whether it's exports out of PAD 1 or PAD 3, or whether it's just simply heating consumption within the pad. So, and I'll close out by just giving an idea of what these movements look like on a product-by-product basis. So these are 2016 flows of HGL-by-rail, and again, we're talking just about these four products: propane, propylene, normal butane, isobutane. The location of the dots is maybe not all-encompassing, but we've attempted to focus on those regions where, let's say, more than other shipments occur or originate out of. So for propane, not too surprising, the back end in PAD 2 is a lead shipper. For PAD 1, the originations come out of the Appalachian region, so as I had mentioned before, western counties of Pennsylvania and West Virginia. But also the destinations are informative. And I think normal butane, for example, is an interesting case in this in this example because what you have is significant storage capacity for HGL in Arizona, but a lot of the consumption for butane is going to be by refiners and blenders of gasoline, and that's going to be where the refineries are in PADD 5. So those intra-PADD movements of normal butane, for example, are I think quite interesting for PADD 5. So with that, we'll go on to questions.
Okay, so we have a first question from someone who asked about collecting carload data. And would we get into the specifics of, say, a DOT 112 versus another type of carload? And while we are seeing carload data, and that's what we're working with, EIA will never publish carload data. We will publish it only in barrels. Barrels is our primary unit that we publish all monthly transportation mode data in. So if you looked at pipelines, if you look at waterborne movements and now rail, you will see it on a barrel per month, 1,000 barrel per month or 1,000 barrel per year, not on a barrel per day basis. So, and we will not get into specifics on carloads. There was another question regarding ethane plus and propane plus mixes, whether we had seen those and chose not to include those.
Well, so as I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, EIA's practice has always been to report the components, right? So propane, propylene, ethane, ethylene. We do not report for any other data series from any of our surveys or on any of our tables any kind of a mix, right? Now, you could see in some places on our website LPG, but that LPG is a sum of its components. There is no suggestion that LPG is in fact a mix, even if in fact it is, right? So we know, for example, that many of the pipelines that were shown on the slide with the map, so on slide 3, carry Y-grade, right? What's called Y-grade, which is a mix of gas plant liquids that is then moved for fractionation, for refining in other areas, right? So, and PADD 4 is a primary example of that, where essentially all the pipelines serving PADD 4 move mixed product, and a lot of that product is moved into PADD 3 for fractionation, right? So those pipelines, and this is known to us, it's known to the market, it's certainly known to the operators, move a mixed product. But if you look at the movements of product by pipe out of PADD 4 into PADD 3 or into PADD 2, you will always see those movements by product. You will see propane being moved, butane being moved, isobutane being moved, and this is how we approach the rail data also. We are not going to report any kind of a mix or any kind of a quality of a mix. We're only focusing on the specific products as they apply to the EIA categories that we have set out a long time ago. Now, do we know that there are mixes being moved? We certainly have reason to believe so. This project has been ongoing for well over a year, and we have had communication with various participants in the market. So we do know that there are propane-propylene mixes being moved, that there are, let's say, propane plus mixes being moved that may contain some ethane. And what we have devised is a method to separate out all those products and report them as the components so that everything that we report looks consistent with previously reported data by the EIA.
Okay, real quick, can you go back to your slide where we show the rail movement series to be published, that one? So we've received some questions where people are curious whether this is aligned with our maps. And I just wanted to go through how to read this table so people understand what they're seeing. The from is your first column on the left. So if it's coming from Canada and going to PADD 5, you will see PADD 5 across the top there where Arup has the cursor, which now has disappeared, but come on down to there. So you're seeing propane, normal butane, and isobutane that are being moved from Canada to PADD 5 because there was a question about that. So it's in there. In addition, there was a question whether we would ever show PADD 1 movements split by PADD 1A, 1B, 1C. And I'm looking at Julie here because she's representing the data side, and I don't believe we have any intention of going to the sub-region or sub-pad level. No.
Not that I've...
Yeah, so we currently present very minimal data at the sub-pad level, and
we don't do product supply at the sub-pad
Right,
level.
and pipeline movements are at the pad level, not at the sub-pad level.
So I think that's something that you won't see. There was also a question about exports to Mexico and whether we would include that. And so I'd like you, Warren, to answer that.
So we actually have developed a methodology, and we have data from the Surface Transportation Board that also shows movements to Mexico or to border crossings. And we have been working through that data trying to determine essentially how good it is and whether there is value there and quality there for us to allow the reporting of this data. So what I can tell you is that, historically, especially 2010 to 2014, it's very poor quality, and the volumes are simply not there for this to be a worthwhile exercise. Now, there is better data sharing with Mexico that EIA has actually stepped up to lead for the Department of Energy. And what we're hoping is that as this data sharing agreement flourishes and the data quality that we receive from the Mexican side improves, we will be able to validate the data that we have and the movements that we have identified as being Mexico-bound. And once we are able to do that, then we will be able to add Mexico as a destination or even as a source of product movements into our tables. But this is not something that we anticipate happening in the near term, simply because we really need that data validation step to be there, and for the data quality to be sufficiently high enough for us to feel comfortable with releasing that data, right? So on the Canadian side, we work, for example, with the National Energy Board, and the U.S. Census has a data sharing agreement with Stats Canada, and that allows us to validate the numbers and to feel comfortable with the shipments we're reporting. But we're not there yet with Mexico. We may be, and in which case we will get there.
There's another question of our PAD 2 rail exports to Canada. So people have seen them on, I guess, the STB data, and so the question is, what are we doing with them? What happened to like normal butane, isobutane? Is the volume below 6,000 barrels a day, and that's what we chose not to include?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the movements are certainly taking place, and if you look at EIA exports data, or if you look at census exports data, you will be able to see movements there. The movements by rail, however, are not consistently crossing that 6,000 barrel per day threshold. What I can tell you is that it looks like probably in the next year, maybe, that may be the case, because those volumes are increasing, and we will continue to reevaluate the data that we receive and the quantities, and if the threshold is reached and we feel comfortable with the quality, we will add those also.
Excellent. There was a question regarding HGL movement from Marcellus, and is the growth of that development, is it mostly moved by rail?
Well, so I think, I'm not going to be able to talk about Marcellus specifically because, again, our data is at the pad level. However, if you now look into our interpad movements and you look at the movements by rail, movements by pipe, movements by water, what you will discover is that shipments of HGL out of pad 1 by rail dwarf anything that's moved by pipe out of pad 1, right? And I think there's a safe assumption that if pad 1 is shipping anything, it's coming out of the producing region.
Okay, and it may include Utica. I mean, we don't know which plays.
Right. Well, so that's right. I mean, it can come from the Utica that's in western Pennsylvania or West Virginia, right? If it's production out of Utica in Ohio, then it's going to be lumped in with pad 2 shipment.
Which leads us into another question we received, which is, will EIA ever consider reclassifying Ohio as part of pad 1? And I'm getting some interesting nods around the room, but unlikely, right? We're not going to change the pad.
That's not on the table.
Not on the table, so sorry. Then there was a question on whether imports from Canada that we're seeing on by rail would be included in the Whipser, which is our weekly petroleum statistics report. And that data, whatever we see in imports and exports that we get in there, should include by all modes.
Yes.
So we have no intention of doing this data on a weekly basis and somehow wrapping it in. This only impacts our monthly data series and will get rolled up at the annual level too for the petroleum supply annual.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things to also emphasize here is the data we receive from the Surface Transportation Board is on a monthly basis also. So, I'm sorry, so yes, actually the data for hydrocarbon gas liquids is essentially a quarterly data set. So, while we are able to split it up into monthly chunks, when we're talking about Whipser, a lot of people are looking at weekly data because they need something that's timely and
Is that a national?
Right, we don't even.
They don't even go regional.
So, well, but we're talking about Canadian movement, right? So that's a national kind of flow. Right. But by the time that we have rail data available for hydrocarbon gas liquids movements across the U.S.-Canada border, the Whipser has already been published and published again.
Okay, you get another question about HGL-by-rail economics. So one of our attendees said, look, when we were doing this with crude by rail, there was a lot of information on the financials. What was going on, it was more expensive to move things by rail, there was all those netback charts. Is there a similar thing for HGL by rail versus pipeline or waterborne modes? Do we have any financial analysis that's going to be forthcoming?
So we haven't really done that analysis yet, and what I can say about this is that many of these movements have been taking place long before there was such a thing as crude by rail, right? So for those who seek to deliver propane to retail propane distributors in New England, or like I said, in the Florida Panhandle, or in places where the coach and pipeline used to deliver propane and now rail is one of the only viable options. So a lot of that has already been explored, and to be frank, pipelines are not a viable option at any time, whether now or 50 years into the future, because these are pretty disparate markets where deliveries occur in 2 or 3 carloads every couple of months to a particular siding. So really lining up economics of pipeline versus rail for many markets is really, I think, a stretch too far. Now, when we're talking about things like the producing region in PADD 1 and whether rail is a viable economic alternative to pipelines, that's something that is worth looking into, and it's something that we may explore in the future, but we haven't done so now.
Okay, there's another quick question, and I'm going to answer this one real fast, is could you get sub-PADD 1 data by calling an EI analyst? No. Okay, because when we're doing the data and getting it aggregated up, we're not even doing it at a sub-PADD level. We're aggregating it to the level that we can use it for publication. So even if you were to call Warren and beg, it wouldn't happen. Okay, so the other question was, would we ever do Canada by province breakout? And again, no, we're not at liberty to do that, and I think NEB and maybe Statistics Canada might have data at a province basis, or maybe in East versus Western Canada. We started looking at it that way, and basically so little was coming from Eastern when we were looking at crude and then ethanol and biodiesel that we just dealt with Canada as one chunk. With HGL, it's slightly different, but again, maybe that'll come out in some analyses that Warren will produce in subsequent Today in Energy articles or other things. There was another question about the presentation, or whether you'll be issuing a white paper on this. And I know you had a plan for how you were going to share the presentation.
Yeah, so this webinar will be publicly available for review. We, as Arup had mentioned, already published a Today in Energy. We have a Natural Gas Weekly Update. In the news piece, we have a This Week in Petroleum piece that's coming out. We will also be publishing methodology for this. So those who wants to get down into the nitty-gritty of just how we made that sausage, you can certainly see it. I'm not sure if you want it, but it'll be public. And in terms of any other analytical work, we have full intention of publishing more Today in Energy articles, more This Week in Petroleum pieces that will further drill down into how this data is obtained and especially how useful it can be for people who are looking at this market.
Okay. There was a question about rail car capacity for LPG in the U.S., and I'm going to say that that kind of question I would address to AAR or FRA, you know, either the Federal Railway Administration or the Association of American Railroads, because they really know the capacity. So many of these cars are leased and moved all over, and they're being traded in and out of different product use. We've seen so many of the crude cars getting repurposed for ethanol and vice versa. I imagine, of course, with many of the products that Warren's talking about, they're in a special type of tanker that wouldn't necessarily be used for crude purposes.
Right. But you know, you can move ammonia, for example, in these cars, a variety of petrochemical products. So the fleet of cars, you know, this is a similar question to what we get sometimes about propane storage capacity, right? And how much storage capacity is there available in the United States for propane? Well, we have a lot of storage capacity throughout the United States, and some of it is purposed for propane. A lot of it is not, and we're talking about the same thing here with rail cars. So even if there were an aggregate number, which we don't know because we don't survey this, this is data shared with us by the Surface Transportation Board. But what I can tell you is just as we talk about storage capacity, the number of rail cars doesn't necessarily translate into how many of those rail cars are dedicated to a particular product at a particular time, because many of them can be repurposed, as can be the case with storage caverns and so forth.
Okay, let's ask, somebody had asked about C5. And so for us, that's natural gasoline or pentanes plus. And we had originally had every intention of including it, but what Warren found was that it was getting mixed in with some crude classifications when you started looking at how it was being produced by an STB. So we were stuck with the standard transport commodity codes that they were using and that the railroads were using when they were creating the way bills and moving the stuff. So it became kind of complicated, and we decided not to do it because we were afraid we might end up double counting things that may already be in crude movements. So for now, there will be no natural gasoline by rail movements produced by EIA. There was another question regarding propane-propylene mix in the PSM data and what we intend to do. So as Warren explained at the start, we decided to show the rail data separated, propane versus propylene, because we had the data. And then our goal is to ultimately get all alkanes and olefins split out in the petroleum supply monthly and petroleum supply annual data. And Warren, Julie, and others are working towards that this year. And our hope is by the time that the petroleum supply annual is produced in the September timeframe, we will see. If not, you won't hold our feet to the fire, but hopefully we will actually be able to split out these products. And maybe also in our outlook, our annual energy outlook. So those are two things that we're moving towards, but no promises yet. Let's see, do we have other safety issue? So again, we are not in the safety business. We are volumetric and in some cases price reporters of information. Safety issues really should be discussed with the Federal Railway Administration. They cover this, and again, the Association for American Railroads. Okay, I think we may have hit all questions.
Do we have any other questions that are coming in now?
Last minute, thanks.
So if anybody needs anything else, feel free to contact Warren or I, and that'll conclude our webinar. Thank you, everybody.